Hey everyone, it's Shaun from Push Talk. Today we have a very special guest with us. Today we're talking with Dr. Adrienne Jones, a professor of political science at Morehouse College, about the Secretary of State office. So let's stay tuned for a delectable conversation with Dr. Adrienne Jones.
The Secretary of State in Georgia is the head election official. So whoever is serving in that office is overseeing elections in the state. Now, Georgia has 159 counties, and they all have separate electoral systems, but they're overseen by the Secretary of State. And importantly, the Secretary of State's office also does things like registers businesses for their corporate filings and oversees the state's securities markets, which is business functions that I don't think people realize are attached to the Secretary of State's office. And this year, when we understand that it's really important that we understand the offices in addition to the candidates, I want everybody to know that the Secretary of State oversees elections. So we're talking about registration and the maintenance of voter rolls and the rules that are going to apply in the particular year. For example, in 2020, our Secretary of State allowed absentee ballots to be more widespread. It's the Secretary of State who's going to make that kind of decision. And then also the office is responsible for some business functions in terms of registering businesses in the state and paying attention to what those businesses are doing.
We asked Dr. Jones what she thought was most important for Georgians to understand about the Secretary of State's office, and this is what she had to say.
I think it's important that people understand that the person that they select in their state to be the Secretary of State is going to be the person who's going to regulate the election as it moves forward. Now, we're in the midst of almost a decade now of a very loud, big lie. For example, that the 2020 election was not fair, that the former president won in some states, including this one, which is Georgia, when in fact the election went very smoothly. It was fair. There was very little fraud. There simply is very little fraud in American elections. However, it's almost a reverse, how do I put this? You know, they're claiming voter fraud in order to arguably cause voter fraud. And so we've seen states, for example, become more draconian in their oversight of elections. And I think it's less draconian in the oversight specifically and more laws that allow state administrators to have more flexibility with counting an electoral vote or certifying an election. And in some of these states, including Georgia, right, who becomes the Secretary of State and whether or not they are an election denier is going to have an impact on the 2024 presidential election, where then we're going to be looking for certifications, particularly of swing states, which are going to matter to the electoral college count. So, for example, in 2020, if Brad Raffensperger and our governor, Brian Kemp, had decided to give the former president the 11,000 and some change votes that he asked for on the phone, that would have fundamentally changed the outcome of the election. And, you know, there are a number of other swing states in which that could happen. Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin are important states to watch. There are also Democratic states right now who have election denier candidates running in them. And there's one more category that I want to tell you about. Then there's like in Wyoming, where there's only the one candidate, no Democratic Party challenger, and the person is not, can't necessarily be relied on to believe that 2020 was a fair election, and therefore it makes me concerned, and I think voters should be generally, about whether or not elections in the various states will be properly managed, properly counted, because it's going to have a real impact on who the president is in 2024.
We asked her what limitations the Georgia Secretary of State's office powers may have.
Well, in the state of Georgia, I mean, the counties actually have a lot more control than they might. So you see in Georgia, when there are disputes about what's supposed to be happening at locals, often the Secretary of State's office will say, well, that's not us. It's the locality. That is to some degree true. However, the state has now passed SB 202, right, which gives our state apparatus and actors, it demotes our Secretary of State in terms of the state election board and his power there. And it also creates some rules whereby the state can oversee a particular county. For example, Fulton County. It can, the Secretary of State can decide who's going to be investigated for voting issues. Whether or not the Georgia the GBI, Bureau of Investigation, is going to be assigned to take a look at something, whether or not absentee ballots will be available and counted. So I think there's a lot of small functions that the Secretary of State engages in that are really important and that people need to recognize are critical.
So the big question we want to know is, why is it important, Dr. Jones, that voters educate themselves about the candidates running?
Okay, so when you say look into the Secretary of State, I think it's really important that you look, for example, in Georgia at the two candidates, right? You're going to look at Brad Raffensperger, who obviously rejected the former president's push to overturn the Georgia election. However, he's still very preoccupied, for example, with election security, which in my mind begs the question, right? The elections are secure. So when we start talking about having election security initiatives or, checking the polls and the rolls to make sure that registrations are valid, I think that's problematic in a situation where the vast majority of registrations are valid and where the elections are running smoothly. So you need to understand a little bit about Brad Raffensperger's background and how he's handled the office of Secretary of State. On the other side here in Georgia is Bee Nguyen. She would be the first person of color to be the Secretary of State. She's obviously interested in election security, but I think from a slightly different perspective than you're talking about with Brad Raffensperger. So I want people to pay attention to the offices that they don't understand, like the Secretary of State, which might have that hidden business function. And then I want them to take a look at the candidates and see what they can learn about does the person deny the 2020 election? Can the person be trusted to certify the election that the people actually achieve? And if the Secretary of State refuses to do that, of course, people's votes, whatever it is that the people cumulatively have said that they want, candidates or particular things that are on the ballot, that's only going to happen if you have a trustworthy Secretary of State who, can be relied upon to translate the people's voice into the Electoral College or into the final results for the midterm elections.
And of course, we could not leave the conversation without knowing if Dr. Jones had more to tell us.
It's important to understand that your elections happen in your state. And even when you're electing the president, right, you're going to actually elect a president in your home state or in your home county and precinct. You're not going to go to Washington, D.C. to do that. So states have traditionally had a lot of control through Article 1 of the Constitution and the 10th Amendment, right? This is a police powers job that falls to the state. In Georgia, the Secretary of State is a statewide office. The person is elected every 4 years. And so everyone in the state is beholden to this one office. Again, with Georgia having a little bit of a rhythm and some freedom in the different counties to make decisions about what they want to do. But ultimately, whether or not the elections are certified from your county or precinct, all comes down to the Secretary of State, right? The atmosphere for the election in your state is going to be set by that person. And so it's very important that people pay attention to what is the Secretary of State, who's running in my state. Is my state a swing state? Is my state, what's happening with redistricting in my state, et cetera, so that we can be knowledgeable voters. And I have to say how much more satisfying it is, right, to be in the ballot box. Actually knowing who's on the ballot makes things faster. It has you more confident. And these in Georgia, these are going to be close elections. So if you feel as if voting is not something that you think is so important and that your vote doesn't really matter, 2022 midterms is the time for you to vote because the splits are going to be really tiny and you're going to be able to see the impact that your vote had.
Remember, October 10th is our last day to register to vote, and let's educate ourselves on who we're voting for. We have a big election. Everybody's looking out for Georgia. Let's make sure we put Georgia on the map.